Thank you very much, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's an honor for me to address fellow communications professionals today. So I'm going to speak a bit about the Melbourne Mandate today, and I'm going to center that conversation around crisis communications that NATO is involved in around the world. And I think particularly topical for us right now is the situation in Syria. So a bit of background on the situation in Syria. And that situation is nothing short than heartbreaking. This slide is a bit dated because as of right now, there have been over 100,000 Syrian people killed in that conflict. So there has indeed been a lot of blood shed. The fighting has been intense. The opposition is fractured. And in fact, there is doubt whether there even is a credible alternative to the Assad regime. The impact on the local population has been horrific. Despair is everywhere. There are attack helicopters and fighter aircraft routinely targeting civilians, and the death toll is catastrophic. Entire neighborhoods have been destroyed. Infrastructure is completely in ruins. And we now know that chemical weapons have been used against innocent civilians in the conflict. And the total number of refugees that have fled Syria for neighboring countries now totals over 1 million people. Again, this slide is a few months old. And to make matters worse, the situation is such that it risks spilling over borders into neighboring regions, which you can imagine would only compound the devastation that we've seen to date. Yet, the international community remains divided. And there's a deadlock and really, unfortunately, no end in sight to this conflict. So one might ask, well, where is NATO in all of this? How come NATO hasn't been involved? Well, that is absolutely true. We are not directly involved in this conflict, and for a number of reasons. First of all, there is a lack of international consensus in the UN, within the Arab League and other organizations. There is not a wide, broad consensus that military intervention is the right thing to do at this point. Many experts believe, in fact, that if NATO or another actor were to get involved in this conflict at this stage, we could risk accelerating that spillover into neighboring regions. And therefore, NATO has been very clear that it believes diplomacy at this time is the only way to proceed with this conflict. And I think there have been some recent progress in that front. Assad has agreed to give up his chemical weapons. That appears to be progressing, and perhaps there is some substance to that promise. We'll see. However, even if those weapons get taken away, the root causes and the conflict will still be going on. NATO has taken some concrete action, however, specifically to protect its ally Turkey. Turkey shares a border with Syria, and due to a number of incidents that happened late last year, including the Turkish aircraft being shot down and several mortars being fired from Syria into Turkey that killed Turkish citizens, the government there is quite understandably nervous, and particularly because of some of the arsenal that the Assad regime possesses. Therefore, late last year, the government of Turkey requested that NATO deploy Patriot air defense assets to augment their air defenses. And the main fear was this: chemical weapons. You've all heard about Syria's chemical weapons, and Turkey has several million people in that border region in the south. And if one of these Scud missiles with a chemical weapon were to impact in a city like Gaziantep, potentially hundreds of thousands of people could be killed. So, a total of 6 batteries were deployed to protect the Turkish citizens of Adana, Gaziantep, and Kahramanmaraş. NATO allies in Germany, The Netherlands and the United States of America were the ones to step up and to provide those batteries, but it really was a collective decision of the 28 to provide the assets. And if you're a communicator like me, you know the value of imagery. And this image really sums up the entire Patriot deployment. And we made sure that every single media op we did was from this vantage point. You can see a Patriot here on the high ground protecting the city of Gaziantep. You can see a Turkish flag flying above the city. You can see several minarets, which emphasize the fact that Turkey is our only Muslim ally. And you see this high ground here? That's just over that ridge is Syrian territory. So it really captures the essence of what the deployment is all about. Now, even with such a defensive deployment, we faced considerable criticism from Iran, Russia, and even from within Turkey itself. And this slide, this picture was taken in January, just outside the German embassy in Ankara. And it's an anti-patriot demonstration organized by the Turkish Communist Party. I would say that's largely politically motivated, but it just goes to show you, you never know where opposition is going to come from. And regardless of the motivation, even though we were there to protect the citizens of Turkey, some citizens of Turkey were not happy with that fact and demonstrated quite vocally. So in environments like these, communicators need a moral compass. And that's why I want to congratulate you, the CPRS, for embracing the Melbourne Mandate and making it an area of focus for your work for the coming months. And we've already had the Melbourne Mandate explained. And I want to tell you that Canadians, and particularly the Canadian military, have a very similar set of language, doctrine, and regulations. And I didn't want to put doctrine up on the screen because there's nothing more boring than that. But I made one of these word clouds with some of our key language that we use, and I think you can see some of the similarities. Now, I have to be honest with you. We learned the hard way about the necessity for this kind of roadmap and guiding principle to govern behavior and particularly communications. I'm sure most of you remember the Somalia scandal of the early 1990s, where a Canadian soldier tortured and killed a young Somali teenager who had broken into their camp. And the institution subsequently covered that up. And we paid a huge price, reputationally, professionally as an organization, and it caused a whole lot of soul searching, a whole lot of change, and really set us up to be the organization that we are today. If it wasn't for this, quite frankly, I'm not sure where we would be, but because of this, something good came out of this terrible incident, and we've really moved forward in terms of not only ethics to do with communications, but ethics to do with governing our operations as well. And because of that, Canada has invested a lot into training its communicators. We have an 8-month-long course in Canada where when we bring people into the military to be military communicators, they have to take this very comprehensive course that covers everything from how government works and very strategic communications, right down to how to execute social media campaigns, how to work with photographers, videographers, from practical right up to strategic. And we are now the leaders in military public affairs in the world. Nobody else has the expertise, training, or experience that Canadian public affairs people have. In fact, of the 28 allies, there are only 5 that even have professional public affairs people in their military. The rest, they have a 2-week course, or they might do it for a year or 2 before they rotate back into their normal trade. And that meant that NATO, or Canada rather, was particularly well positioned to influence NATO doctrine. And a few years ago, NATO redid its communications doctrine, and if you put them side by side to Canadian doctrine, it's almost the same. We've really punched above our weight in the area of public affairs and communications within the NATO alliance. So that brings me to the first point of the Melbourne Mandate that I want to talk to you, and that is defining your organization's character and values. So how do we do that in NATO? Well, I believe that before you can define how you want others to perceive you, you better first think about how they currently perceive you. And I think you've all heard the saying, perception is reality, and I think to a large extent that is absolutely true. So how is NATO perceived? As a NATO communicator, I hope it's like this. I hope that people think that we're very capable. I hope they think that we're interested in diplomacy and partnerships, that we have modern, cutting-edge forces, and in fact that we're invincible, that we're united in our commitment to collective defense, that we're welcomed by those we try to help, and that we're making a real difference where we serve. We're also able to project military power and influence when we're asked to do so by our governments, and I hope they think that we're always ready to help defend freedom, human rights, and uphold security and stability in our world. But I know for a fact that there are those that perceive us differently. And we have to expect and accept differing viewpoints and plan our own strategies accordingly. Because no matter how hard we try, there will always be those who oppose us. There will always be counter messages out there, and we better be prepared to deal with them and not just ignore them. So how do we react to these communications challenges? How does NATO go about communicating its character and values, much like the Melbourne Mandate encourages us to do? Well, experts tell us that if you can't explain the core of your organization in 30 seconds or less, you've got it wrong. You've got to have an elevator speech. I'm sure you've heard that said. So we recognize that we need an elevator speech in NATO because we want to equip all of our people, the thousands of people we have from generals down to privates. And if they can't understand what our core message is, then the audience certainly won't understand it. So that's ours right there. 3 letters. A whole NATO military alliance of 28 nations boiled down into 3 simple letters. And V stands for value and values. We believe that the NATO alliance brings good value to its members because we pool and share resources across 28 different countries. So it doesn't make sense for Canada to have aircraft carriers, but perhaps it makes good sense for us to be experts in frigates, submarines, maritime aircraft, and we'll let somebody else worry about the aircraft carriers. We also are reflective of the values of our 28 members. Freedom, democracy, human rights, those types of things. We stand for that, we represent that everywhere we go, and we try to demonstrate it in some of the worst parts of the world when we're there on operations. And finally, we bring value in terms of security to allow our societies to function and our economies to prosper. And you take away security, and those things we take for granted suddenly become in jeopardy. And it's sometimes a challenge to remind people of that, but it's important nonetheless. The C stands for capabilities. We want to demonstrate that we've got the capability to protect the members of the alliance, no matter what the threat might be. And we can do that across the spectrum from disaster relief and humanitarian assistance to peacekeeping, to peacemaking, to full high-intensity combat if we would need to do that. We want to be ready for any eventuality, including some emerging threats like cyber. And I guarantee you that the next conflict that this world sees, this is going to play a determining factor, cyber, and so we're spending a lot of time thinking about those types of emerging challenges. And we're modernizing and transforming to keep pace. And the P stands for partnership. Some people think that NATO is a war machine. We're often labeled as a bunch of generals in a dark room just plotting the next big military operation so we can get more tanks and planes and things like that. Actually, this is our priority, is building relationships with people. We're building relationships in Northern Africa, we're building relationships in the Middle East, as well as with the former Soviet bloc, Russia, Ukraine. Why? Because the best way to prevent conflict is to diffuse it through diplomacy before it ever starts. Sometimes our job is pretty easy, and we get those kind of toys to interest media to get them to come. It's not very hard. But making it all work together and getting everybody on message can be a challenge. The greatest asset that we have, we believe, is our people. And NATO doctrine empowers each and every one of the thousands of members in the NATO alliance to speak about their role and about their own experiences. And so we give them that VCP strategy, and we send them out and ask them to communicate. And I believe we truly are stronger together because of that. The second point of the mandate is to instill responsible behaviors within your organization. And that certainly is crucial, and it is very relevant to what we do in the military. Within NATO Public Affairs, we have an unwavering commitment to tell the truth in everything that we do. But that begs the question, what is the truth? Is the truth that which is most persuasive? Do we always acknowledge the whole truth? Many people, soldiers included, believe that the truth is a necessary casualty during times of war, and that we need to unleash the tools of propaganda to dominate the information battle space. However, the black and white stereotypes used by the propagandists of 60 years ago, they worked pretty well back during World War II. But I submit that this type of effort would be exposed in a matter of hours or days due to the information environment of today with the social media networks, the 24/7 media. I don't even think that type of program is possible today. The environment that we face is more interconnected and complex than ever. Our doctrine is clear. Accuracy and transparency are mandatory. So that means if we inadvertently kill civilians on one of our operations, if one of our soldiers abuses a detainee, we have no choice. We have to talk about it. But what about our adversaries? How do they conduct their communications activities? Are these guys going to follow the Melbourne Mandate? Somehow I don't think so. In fact, they use captured soldiers as fodder for their propaganda campaigns, and that's a clear violation of the Geneva Convention. They boast about their abilities to kill and wound our own soldiers, and as well as local civilians to sow terror. And they regularly circulate graphic imagery of both civilian and military casualties, and most of those images I'd rather not show you today. Some say that NATO is losing the communications battle to a bunch of Taliban leaders hiding in a cave somewhere with cell phones. I don't believe that's the case. In fact, when I was in Afghanistan last in 2009, I heard this from some people in my headquarters that we were somehow losing the communications battle. And my question was, well, based on what? Of course, there wasn't any empirical evidence, so I started a media analysis program, and we started tracking message permutation and repetition and things in both the Canadian media and in the Afghan media to see whose messages were playing the loudest, who was getting portrayed in the most favorable light. And in both cases, our messages got far more traction than that of our adversary. And what was a surprise to me was that in the Afghan media, we were actually being portrayed more positively than in the Canadian media. And I think that had something to do with the fact that the journalists in Afghanistan are young, educated, urban people who just don't like the Taliban. I will submit that there is one area where we were being out-communicated, however, and that's in the rural areas of southern Afghanistan. No electricity, few roads, no internet. The literacy rates are around 70%. Illiteracy rates, rather, are 70% for men, and 90% of women cannot read or write in these areas. So when we arrive with our messages of democracy, freedom, women's rights, and the need to stop growing poppies, the people there look at us like we're from another planet. And perhaps the most effective propaganda machine the Taliban has is the brainwashing of thousands of young kids in religious madrasas located in Pakistan and in other countries. Pretty difficult to compete with that. And when the brainwashing doesn't work, threatening letters delivered in the middle of the night, followed up by executions the next morning, tend to get the message across. Deception and lies for these guys are the rule rather than the exception. And I think in the future, the adversaries that we face will adopt very similar practices. In the recent conflict between Georgia and Russia, there was a lot of nefarious activity going on. And there was documented proof that both sides in that conflict were staging and altering imagery to support their propaganda campaigns. And this is one example. These photos were supposedly taken in two different places at two different times, but you can see this guy here who's dead or mortally wounded. He's got the same shirt, same shoes, same guy, but he's face up here, face down here. And his best friend, who's sort of mourning him here, is now a sort of casual bystander in this photo. And the interesting thing, both of these were run by Reuters at the time. So it works, is the unfortunate reality. And the Taliban have been deliberately distorting information since day one in Afghanistan. When we have incidents where they successfully hit us with IEDs, it's standard practice for them to inflate the casualties by a factor of 5 or more. So we lose one guy, they say we lost 7 or 8, and that's par for the course. And the same applies to civilian casualties. If we drop a bomb and try to take out some insurgents, they automatically will say, you hit a wedding party, there's 20 women and children that you killed. And they've been caught by media inflating the casualty count. Unfortunately, the next time it happens, the media faithfully report the words of the Taliban spokesperson, usually without too many questions. So how do we combat this? Well, we believe our primary weapon is the truth, and in fact, that's the motto of the Canadian Public Affairs Branch, Veritas, which is Latin for truth. And you know what? I'm not going to lie to you, but lies in the short term could result in some tactical advantage in these campaigns. But we firmly believe that over the medium and longer term, it's far better to be truthful, because if you're not, your credibility will disappear, and then once it's gone, it's gone. So when groups like the Taliban say you killed 20 women and children at a wedding, we try to prove them wrong with the truth. And we dig up the footage from the aircraft that dropped the bomb, and we show actually it was just a truck in the middle of the desert, and the only guys we killed were the bad guys that we were targeting. The problem that we still have is the time it takes us to get this documented proof. Sometimes we have to send military people to very remote areas to investigate the collateral damage that we may or may not have caused. And this could take hours or even days to do. And during that gap, the Taliban spokespersons are repeating their message that we killed 20 civilians. And that gap hurts us. That's why we have capabilities like information operations and psychological operations within the military. But these organizations are not well understood, and they make people feel uncomfortable. Who are these psychological and information operations troops? And what is it that they do? Some people would have you believe that we've got this guy on the payroll, or maybe even this guy. But I think most of us realize that manipulation, mind control, and things like that, they're the great subjects for Hollywood movies, but in reality, it's just not even possible to execute that kind of thing in today's information environment, unless you're talking about a cult or some kind of very small, closed environment where perhaps it is effective. Now, when we go to places like Afghanistan, we're going halfway around the world, we're dealing with people, we don't speak their language, we have a very difficult time understanding their culture because it's completely different than ours. We don't understand their power structures, how they communicate. So to suggest that we can elevate our programs to this kind of level is, quite frankly, not true. We have a difficult time even analyzing the media and the audiences we're trying to talk to. And I would say it took us a good 3 or 4 years before we started to understand the Afghan tribal dynamics and power structure there. And still to this day, we really don't completely understand how they operate. And here's a really good example. Everyone knows that the reason that NATO went to Afghanistan in the first place is because of 9/11, right? Well, think again. At the 10-year anniversary of 9/11, a British journalist took this picture to rural Afghanistan and showed it to a bunch of tribes people and said, "What is this? Describe this, what you're seeing in this image." And most of them had no idea what they were looking at. And the number one response to his question was, it must have been some kind of attack in the Afghan capital of Kabul. They couldn't even place that this image was taken in New York City. And that goes to show you what we were up against communicating to Afghan people in that environment. You know, the very rationale we firmly believed and communicated for several years, we're coming here because this attack was launched from your country by a group of people that we needed to deal with to make sure it doesn't happen again. And all along, we didn't realize they had no idea this had even taken place. So we need information and psychological operations soldiers to try to bridge these cultural gaps, to identify and study the cultures that we're operating in, and find ways that we can communicate across those cultures. That's what they do. And they could use tools like a loudspeaker, like what this guy is using, and probably during some kind of operation. It could be a radio program, and we've set up a radio station Canada did in Kandahar called Rana Radio. It runs programs on things like women's rights, government services, just basic things that we want people to embrace. Or it could be like this, dropping leaflets, encouraging people to stand up against the Taliban. These methods aren't very sophisticated, but in rural Afghanistan, there aren't many alternatives, to be frank, so we have to use what works. Here's an example of a leaflet that was dropped in the air campaign over Libya. And we try to target the lower echelons of the adversary because they're less committed to the cause than the higher ups. And basically we're asking those people that were operating tanks or flying planes or whatever to give up, or otherwise you're going to face that kind of a thing. Here's an example produced by the Afghan government because we're teaching them how to do this for themselves. And it says, you know, the Taliban, it's run by a bunch of people that don't even live in Afghanistan. Why? Don't be a slave to these guys. Get rid of them, and let's move on to a better future for Afghanistan. And here's a billboard that calls on Afghans to support the central government. Other campaigns encourage people to call in if they see IEDs being planted by bad guys, phone the local police. And really, it all comes down to credibility. And I can tell you that when it comes to public affairs, we never engage in any kind of deception or manipulation of the truth. And quite frankly, 98% of the time, our colleagues in psychological operations and information operations do exactly the same thing because credibility is everything. I say 98% of the time because it is possible that, let's say we're going to conduct a military operation the following day. Military tactics, we like to try to deceive the adversary about what we might be about to do. So sometimes they may leak out some unofficial information to lead people to believe we're going to do one thing when in fact we're going to do another. It's always very tactical in nature. It's always aimed primarily at adversarial audiences. And the rationale for doing it is always to save the lives of soldiers. But because they do a little bit of that stuff from time to time, our two communities are separate. There's a firewall in between them because I will never tell the media something that is not true, whether it's going to save soldiers' lives or not. I'm prohibited by regulation from doing that. So there's a gap between us. Public affairs is planned, executed, coordinated, separate from these guys. But we do have to coordinate. We need to know what each other is doing. Why? Because the world is so connected. And if we're putting out messages that are contradictory to what our colleagues are doing, we're in trouble. I'm going to rapidly finish up here because I'm over time, but another debate is the inform versus influence debate. Some people say that public affairs should only purely inform people and never try to influence. Certainly, IO and PSYOPs are trying to influence people to call the police or support the government. I would say that you can't communicate without influencing. There's always a degree of influence. That's why we talk about ethical influence. So I think most people would be quite comfortable with the fact that I was here today trying to explain to you that NATO is a capable, relevant organization, but they would be uncomfortable if I was trying to convince you to take action against groups of people that didn't hold those beliefs. So we have to know what is ethical and what isn't ethical. And there's a difference between official and unofficial as well. And public affairs, we own the official communication. Websites, communication to the media, social media, all that where it's identified as coming from NATO or from Canada, that's us. The things that our colleagues do, it's unofficial. And it all comes down to trust. Our center of gravity is our capability, and we can never afford to do anything that would jeopardize that. The last topic in the Melbourne Mandate is listening to your audiences. And I don't think we're doing anything radically different than you are using social media and other tools to really engage with your audiences. So I elected not to elaborate on that point in favor of the first two, which I think are, there's some unique military aspects of that. But I will practice the listening side of the house by, first of all, saying if you want to give me feedback or ask questions or any of those sorts of things, that's how you can contact me. I'd love to hear from you, good or bad. And at this time, I'd really be happy to take your questions. Thanks very much.